Okay, I'm giving this presentation with the assistance of Terry Hugh and Kirby Wright, who are also members of the Alberta Land-use Knowledge Network. We're a creation of the Alberta Environments and Sustainable Resource Development's Land Use Secretariat. About 4 years ago, they wanted to create a knowledge network for land use practitioners and policymakers in Alberta, and they approached Foothills Research Institute after we won the bid to create this knowledge network around land use. And as part of that process, one of the very first things I did when I was hired under contract to work with Foothills was to come to the Alberta Soil Science Workshop, and with the intention of figuring out what a land use knowledge network would look like. Well, it was here already. I didn't have to create a knowledge network for soil scientists, agrologists who were interested in land use policy and practices, reclamation specialists. It was already in the room. But what was really apparent was that as soon as people stopped speaking, the really good information they presented had gone to ether, and at best you got a PDF of their PowerPoint presentations, and you had to figure out what was the real message in between the slides. And so at that point, we started to recognize that our best use as a knowledge network was to come to really good volunteer and professional organizations that were involved with land use practices and research, and make their information more widely available. So this presentation is in a way a thank you back to the Alberta Soil Science Workshop for the really good information that we've been able to pick up over the last 3 conferences, and we're doing again the service that we did in the past, which is video record some of your presentations and put them up on our website and also onto YouTube for people to get back to later on. So that's what we're about. What I'm going to talk to you about is what we heard. We've attended over 40 conferences over the past year, and this is our summary of really important stuff that, as in general, if you're involved in land use aspects across Alberta, these are some of the things you should be paying attention to. First of all, urban agriculture. This is not a fad, and there was a lot of discussion, particularly if you were paying attention to what was going on in Edmonton last year with the Northeast Edmonton planning process, and whether the greenhouses and market gardens would continue to have a life after the new development plan was put together for Northeast Edmonton, whether agriculture had a place inside the boundaries of the city of Edmonton. And the overwhelming sense was that no, we don't really keep agricultural land inside urban boundaries. That agricultural land inside urban boundaries is a placeholder for land to be developed. We're missing the boat. And there's a good set of practice already out here in Alberta around both spin gardening, which is developed out of by a market gardener out of Saskatoon that has become quite popular across North America. If you're going to talk about yourself as a beginning farmer, and you ask yourself the question, how do I get into the business of farming without putting myself behind the 8 ball in terms of the level of investment to become a farmer, urban agriculture is the way to go at it. Because quite frankly, where's your customer today with the most disposable income? India? China? Europe? United States? How about Alberta? Where's your market growing? Where's your your more youthful market that is really interested in local food? It's in Alberta. And so if you're a beginning farmer saying, I need to find a way to not only to grow a product, but to market it, you should be looking at urban agriculture and local food. So there's a place here for us to pay attention to it, and as soil scientists, the real challenge that these folks have as they get into this is that they're trying to take land that has been developed for residential backyards and try to turn it back to horticultural soils, and there's a real challenge there for them in terms of composting and other kinds of soil workup that has to be done. So that's the number one for us to look at. And so there's our role as soil scientists. And by the way, we put together an online course on urban agriculture, ran it for the first time in November, a 4-week course that covered economics, planning, technology, and the social dynamics. We had 350 people register for that course, primarily from Alberta, with a week and a half of publicity. And then the Alberta Professional Planners Institute came to us and said, can you run that course again? And right now, today, we've got 90 planners in Alberta registered to take that as a professional development course. So this is not a fad. LIDAR and wet areas mapping. Maybe I've been hanging around Barry White too long with ASRD, but I agree with them that in the context of how we're going to do resource planning, particularly in the green zone, LIDAR is critical, and it will be a game changer in the way we do that planning in the future. And we've got to get ourselves to the place where we really can use that data properly. And there's a training issue out there. I'm going to talk about some water issues here that sort of reflect what the province heard through some of their water conversations. But here's one that people aren't talking about, particularly in the South Saskatchewan Basin. I think the experts know it. The public probably is aware of it, but nobody's saying it out loud. And that is, you aren't going to develop anything in southern Alberta unless you have, one, the City of Calgary on side in terms of supplying you with water, or the irrigation districts. Cross Iron Mills was not an aberration. It was the bellwether of what we are facing in terms of southern Alberta. The only entities in southern Alberta that have allocations of water above what they currently use is the City of Calgary, and they use about 47% of the water that they're allocated. So you keep hearing about pipelines from Calgary, or it's the irrigation districts. And so my 40s, there's always a $64 question around that you always want to ask. And if you're looking at Calgary and the irrigation districts as being the folks to say yay or nay to whether you get your particular development going if you need water, the $64 question is, can these entities, the Calgary, City of Calgary, and the irrigation districts, can they up their game in terms of thinking about the consequences of regional development? So that's not their primary role right now. And then the $64 question on the other side is, if they can't up their game, then what does the province do in terms of leaving those allocations with those entities? So Okotoks is a real good example of the kind of constraints recognized about 3 or 4 years ago that they had maybe about growth for another 2,000 residents with their current allocation, decided that they were going to present themselves as being the conservation and sustainable resource development model for municipal development, and last year abandoned that when they realized that the MD of Foothills was quite ready to offer developers subdivisions and industrial development opportunities just outside the boundaries of Okotoks. And so now Okotoks is out in the market to buy water rights licenses, and they've taken the freeze off their development. 2,000 folks is not where they're going to stop. So there's the kind of consequences we've got, and there is a Calgary veto. There's not enough water, and there's still urban sprawl. And we haven't taken so there's the challenges, and Jason will probably talk more about that. The Alberta lakes. The interesting story around our control of water pollution in Alberta is that we have done a remarkable job in protecting our rivers. In fact, our the levels in our rivers are back down to the 1960 levels with tremendous growth in industry and population. And that's how well we've protected our rivers through the kinds of limits we put on loadings and concentrations that industry and municipalities are allowed to release. You couldn't swim, you certainly couldn't have contact with water below Edmonton back in the 70s and 80s, and we're back down to 1960 levels. That is not true with Alberta lakes, and they're an orphan jurisdictionally. And the lake management societies, which are volunteer groups that talk about our opportunities for managing lakes for recreation, are saying, who the heck do we talk to get our lakes properly managed? And they get caught between the municipalities that have the responsibilities of area structure plans around lakes, which says what kind of developments can go up around lakes. And then they have a question of what does environment really say in terms of what goes into the lake. And we've left this one pretty much out there. And that's the issue for those folks. And the Watershed Planning Advisory Councils are asking the same question. Hydraulic fracturing. I come from Devon, which is where the first major oil well that really turned on the oil industry in Alberta was drilled in 1947, and I was sitting around the table with some old-timers from the oil gas industry and said, what do you guys think about hydraulic fracturing? And they said, what's the problem? And they're right. When I moved to Devon in 1985, the wells around there were supposed to be shut down. They were going to shut the wells down and turn it into a natural gas field. That was back in 85 to 88. Those are still oil, well, they're still producing oil out of that field. How did we do it? We did something that we've been doing since the 1940s, which is a version of well rehabilitation, and that's where the whole concept of hydraulic fracturing came from. This is not new technology. We've been doing it a long time. And the oil and gas industry asks us what the problem is in Alberta. And yet, when we do a survey, and this is a survey that the Petroleum Technology Alliance of Canada folks did, provided research dollars for, to a graduate student and industry person. This is a survey of Whitecourt and Fox Creek. Fox Creek is an oil gas town, Whitecourt's a forestry town, and the response wasn't any different in either town about what folks thought the industry was providing around information about hydraulic fracturing that was happening close by to their community. So even the oil and gas folks that are employed by the industry and are probably involved in some of the local activities don't think they're getting good information from the industry. This is the classic, I've got a septic field well contamination problem. This is also Bragg Creek. And Bragg Creek has an alluvial aquifer that is quite shallow, and people in Bragg Creek would tell you stories about how they stood in the shower and smelled the urine from their neighbor's septic field as they took their showers. This went on for decades. There are boil water orders in Bragg Creek. And the real issue is that when we talk about rural subdivision development and why there's a continuous debate particularly in southern Alberta, around what should constitute the criteria for a rural subdivision development, this is at the crux of the problem. Acreage owners don't want to pay enough for good well and good wastewater treatment to protect the resource. And that's why Bragg Creek went on for years and years with boil water orders. It cost them $10.5 million to fix that problem, and it was the MD of Rocky View that actually made that happen. And when you look at that kind of issue, I start to ask the question whether Bragg Creek isn't your poster child for Alberta communities that have both utilities and environmental protection issues. $10.5 million to correct this kind of a problem Then the flood came, and they have 35 houses that are now being bought out because of the flood. So you got questions of whether the development was in the right place. And then they've got the issue of whether there should be some forest harvesting and a fire smart program in an area that, when it was first settled, didn't have any trees and hasn't had a major forest fire since 1930. And my real issue is that I had somebody who's a long-time wildfire manager say that when she drove through Bray Creek, her toes curled. And if you're looking at a community that is not ready, I think Bray Creek is probably a place that we really want to start to pay attention to in terms of whether we're getting ourselves prepared for what growth really means and what good municipal planning really looks like in a responsible fashion. So there's Bray Creek, and there's our issues around septic fields and wells. So I'm going to, let's see, go back here and just read you this slide. And this one is coming to the issue of property rights and what we offer farmers in terms of their rights to subdivide. So I'm just going to read this to you. My family, and this is a farmer in the BC Peace region. They have a BC Land Commission that restricts land subdivisions. So my family has farmed 3 sections of land here for the past 37 years. My wife and I want to retire. We want to stay on the home place and sell the rest of the farm so that we can use the money for our retirement. We applied to the Agricultural Land Commission to divide our home place from the rest of the farm so we could sell the land. They turned us down. They told us this is not allowed. This is thanks we get after working the farm for 37 years. Now in Alberta, they wouldn't have that problem. Typically, most municipalities allow you at least 2 subdivisions off the quarter section. First parcel out has been around for a long time, so and typically you can get up to 4 subdivisions out of a quarter section. That's fairly typical in Alberta. Here's the real issue. So what's wrong with this picture? And here's what's wrong with the picture. If you read what the City of Edmonton says is industrial land, heavy industrial is classified as industry where noise, dust, and other pollutants cannot be confined to the industrial site. Includes activities both inside and outside buildings. Outside activities can include equipment that can be dangerous to operators and bystanders. This is from Edmonton's definition of what heavy industrial is. Unfortunately, even inside urban municipalities, agricultural land and subdivisions are put side by side. We certainly don't put industrial land and subdivisions side by side, and then we wonder why we've got commercial agriculture saying we can't survive in a situation where subdivisions happen willy-nilly as farmers start to get their retirement money out of their land. And so you can't have both. Property rights and right to farm have got some mutual challenges when we try to talk about them together. I don't want to take an awful lot more time. There's a series of other issues that we should probably talk about, but one of them that is really apparent to me is that as we go forward and talk about particularly land management in agriculture and the role of protection of prairie soils and where they're going, we've got to get to the place where we recognize the place of fire. And one of the things I took away as an agriculturalist or as an agrologist, hanging out with a bunch of foresters, and that's where Foothills Research Institute's roots are in forestry research. They have come to the place of talking about healthy landscapes and natural disturbance. Now, if you're going to go in and harvest trees, it's a pretty large disturbance on the landscape, and foresters have been forced to figure out how do you do forest harvesting or tree harvesting in a way that starts to mimic what Mother Nature would do. And the biggest thing that happens out there in terms of natural disturbance, of course, is fire. And so you say, what does Mother Nature do when we have fire on the landscape? And so we're now at a place where we're starting to talk about the role of fire and what really went on before we stopped fire. And we did stop fire really well in this province for 100 years. We don't recognize that before we came as pioneers to this landscape, that in fact the native people used fire to manage the landscape for the wildlife that they wanted to harvest. They didn't want to harvest caribou, so they didn't want old growth forest. They burned this Jasper River Valley quite regularly most springs before there was thunderstorms in the season. So we've got that evidence in the tree rings that fires happened in that valley in the springtime. And what were they doing? They were managing for elk and moose, not caribou. And so you've got that kind of process that we are just getting back to. The same questions should be asked around our management of rangelands and cultivated land on the prairies. We come in and we do industrial development and big natural disturbance, and so that's where we wind up at. So my final wrap-up comment is that Alberta has a challenge. We've always considered ourselves big and wide open, and quite frankly, with the amount of industrial developments going on, there's not probably a quarter section in the province anywhere where you can't find some imprint of human activity. And areas where we thought we were big and wide open, even our natural grasslands, are very busy places. And so we've gone from big and wide open to small and busy. And we have a tough time. We all instinctively know that, but we have a tough time behaving if that's our new reality.